Welcome to Your Brain on Science. It's really great to have everyone with us today. And we have a treat for you guys. We have a very special guest. Mr. Leonard Pickard is here with us today, and he's going to talk to us about his experiences related to psychedelics. And this is going to be a bit of an open conversation, so you guys will get a taste of a little bit of everything.
Yes, and so for those who don't know, Leonard Pickard is known allegedly as the largest producer of LSD in the 20th century, but he also has an educational background in various drugs, pharmacology, drug policy, and more. And he's been directly affected by the war on drugs and sentenced to prison for 2 life sentences, of which he has been released and is now living in Santa Fe. And we're just so grateful to bring him on today to hear his story. So welcome, Leonard.
Well, thank you, Zarmeen and Alaina. I'm very happy as well to be released and living in Santa Fe, and grateful for it. Before we get started, I'd just like to say hello to your audience. I hope they appreciate your marvelous advancements as graduate students in neuroscience. Your important work that you are doing, and encourage all students that are listening to this program to pursue a similar path. Be as educated as you can. Join in this great celebration with strong scientific support. My dear friend, the late Sasha Shulgin, always said, "Get that PhD." So let Sasha's encouragement ring in your ears.
Amazing. Some great words. So let's get right into it. All right. So let's take everyone back. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you became involved with psychedelics, right? Socially, academically, in terms of your work, and what it was like, living in the 60s and in the 70s and having all these experiences going on around you, and being really ensconced in psychedelics and the movement then. So.
Well, I mean, that's quite an open-ended question.
It really is.
I could probably go on for days, but let's see. According to the government, my first interaction with the psychedelic world was at 21. It's, oh my God, 55 years ago, while working as a lab tech at the Retina Foundation for Experimental Biology in Cambridge, extracting mitochondria from beef heart, in which we heard about this marvelous change in society among the young people at the time in California due to an exotic neurochemical. I thought this was quite unusual. According to the government, a small quantity was synthesized there, shared about Beacon Hill. Then travel occurred between Cambridge and Berkeley. I became a manager of the bacteriology department at Berkeley at 22, and did some unusual things in the basement of the biochemistry building. Young future Nobel laureate Carrie Mullis was just upstairs working rather late, doing interesting things. And at that time, this is 1968 or so, Carrie made what he called the magic gram, and a single gram of a Nobel laureate's pure LSD. Of course, there were no analytical instruments that we could use at that time, but there were certainly a lot of willing volunteers. So there's some extraordinary nights in Berkeley. Berkeley in those years was all lit up with burning barricades from the anti-war demonstrations against Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Telegraph Avenue, which has always been kind of a lively hotbed of dissent, was wall to wall with very long-haired young people having these marvelous experiences, and no older people to talk to about it. Mm-hmm. It was "don't trust anyone over 30" was the mantra. There was no internet. People communicated by telephone, letters, no computers. If you wanted a bit of data, you had to go through a card file in the library catalog downstairs into the bowels of the library among millions of volumes, pull out a heavy text, and perhaps there's your information. An all-day event that we can do now with a keystroke.
Yeah.
So in those days, there were pockets of young people that were having these unusually profound religious, magical, philosophical experiences, but we could only talk to each other about it. To elders, it would sound much too far out. And a situation like that continued for the next 30 or 40 years. One risked one's career if we're an academic and mentioned the word psychedelic or an interest in it. That was absolutely forbidden and would extinguish any hope of tenure. Now, of course, it's extraordinary to see throughout the United States centers opening. Emory, Michigan, Wisconsin, Hopkins, Yale, UCLA, Berkeley. Stunning. I remain floored at the exceptional change in society that we're undergoing. It's a period of enormous enthusiasm and great hope. But it was also in the early 60s, although something of a smaller, perhaps less public event due to more insular communication. And then the great government oppression stepped in. Perhaps it's too big at this point to fail. Perhaps there are too many eyes, too many distinguished eyes, too many advanced degrees, billions of dollars flowing into the space. It's unlikely that it will truly significantly reverse as it did, say, in 72, 73. But I do expect to shoot a drop. We see small inklings of it with some, dissent in the psychedelic community and some reportable issues, inappropriate therapist behavior here and there, unexplained death. There are little issues that are seen, but so far nothing truly florid that the media would attach to. As we continue to process people, vet people through clinical trials worldwide with looser standards, that may change. But presently, it's truly a honeymoon season, and the greatest celebration I've seen in my lifetime.
Yeah. I'm curious about, so did you kind of maybe experience sort of a culture shock when you were released and seeing psychedelics being like everywhere now and like all in the media? And I'm sure you heard about it too while you were in prison, but through like letters and writing with people, but.
Well, no, I had a very attenuated form of information. Occasionally a copy of the New York Times would float around, but generally all we had the TVs hanging from the ceiling with hundreds of men staring at them all day. A Fox News on, we'd hear a little bit of that. But generally, I had only inklings of the phenomenon that was occurring socially. Of course, I was aware of Rowland's great work at Hopkins and his strongly vetted article in the Journal of Psychopharmacology and the tremendous suggestion that for treatment-resistant depression, these were particularly efficacious. That to me was the watershed moment.
So you had heard about those clinical trials?
Yes, I was aware of all that. I sent my son at 17 to visit Rowland's lab, very kindly received him. So yes, I was aware of all that work, but not the extremes to which it would be interpreted so broadly as effective for a wide variety of psychiatric illnesses. And just to address that at the moment, we do see, I'm in venture space right now, so I see a lot of applications for investment. And we see every medical indicator being claimed, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, marital problems, autism, every neurodegenerative disease known. Of course, the mechanisms for all these different difficulties, traumatic brain injury, what have you, TRD, are widely variable.
Yeah.
And the idea that a single class of compounds could be more effective than established drugs for these is wildly speculative.
Mhm.
But there's such hope, and so many high quality trials occurring that I expect that in the next few years we will see marvelous and newly effective medicines. But I do feel that 90% of the claims of indicators or applications will wash out
Mhm.
and fail. But we're going to learn more in the next 18 months than we've known in the last 1,000 years about this class of compounds.
Right. And that's so cool.
Time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Even if it doesn't necessarily work for everything we want it to, right? We're still gaining so much important information about what these psychedelics can do. So
right, it will work for some things. The question is which ones. I think most applications will fail. People are applying it to intractable pain, for which morphine's been very effective for quite a long time. Applications that are almost opportunistic.
Yeah.
In the sense of, well, let's claim this and let's drive a seed round or an A round for it. But other things are, inherently promising. They're great work, for example, by Gilgamesh. That's Dolly Sames, chair of chemistry at Columbia's laboratory, and his great postdocs there are doing a wide variety of variations on the ibogaine molecule in order to reduce cardiotoxicity. And of course, the anecdotal reports of people that have had strong addictions to opiates, cocaine, what have you, and even non-drug severe abuse in their childhood, we keep hearing these almost strongly significant anecdotal reports. If those hold up clinically, then we're truly onto something. I think we will have several new drugs that will surpass any known treatment in the pharmacopoeia in psychiatry in the next 4 to 5 years. But I think most will be expensive experiments.
Yeah. But I think, maybe needed, because these ideas are finally able to be tested, right? There was so much restriction, and I'm sure I'm the last person that needs to tell that to you, right? But so much restriction, and it might be opportunistic, but it's also very useful, because we need to understand that, I think people need to fully understand that these will not work for everything, will not work for everyone, right? And having real data to back that up is going to be vital, and maybe opportunistic, but also very, very smart to get into some of these areas that are wide open, I think, and need people to be studying them. So yeah.
And in terms
of, I mean, it's not just psychedelics that we're looking at. We are in an evolutionary moment in genomics,
yes,
proteomics, metabolomics. We are, goodness, AI.
Yeah, the
Very
sophistication
friendly
of the
with
method.
GPT-4.
Absolutely.
AI and drug development. It's a new era in neurochemistry itself, which is a much broader field than psychedelics. Where we'll modify personality, we'll modify memory and learning. So we will enter an age where it will be possible to cognitively enhance an individual. I don't mean psychedelic experience. I mean statistically increase one's ability on a standardized exam, for example, or recall of information, or a greater cognitive performance. Spearman's G is generally used as a measure of cognitive performance. It's a battery of about 20 tests beyond the Stanford Binet, beyond IQ, all sorts of neurological assessments involved in Spearman's G. And G may be able to be significantly, if not profoundly, advanced by genomic or pharmacologic means. So that will be the true revolution.
With a lot of capability comes a lot of responsibility. And that's something that we can talk about with almost anything in science, right? With the ability, with now that we have the ability to, the most basic example, to alter, genes in a human being, it alter genes in animals, and it's things that we've seen, right? And it gives rise to all of these moral arguments. And that in the field of psychedelics is already, such a big deal, the ethics of the work being done. And especially, I think, in your time, considering the ethics of that, and there was already so much of a stigma. So it's a little bit hard to tease that apart, right? So with all of these new advancements, with all of these new methods, of course, it's very exciting and you sound very excited about it. Do you think that we can leverage this to make changes that might not, be necessarily pharmacological, like the changes that we're looking at with psychedelics, if we can have changes that are equally as large and sort of, I keep saying the word changes, but like life changing, right? With all of these methods. Do you think the intersection of that is interesting, and the moral arguments that can rise from all of that?
Well, yes. Well, bioethics, of course, is an exploding field, and a great deal
absolutely.
due to these particular technologies. With the psychedelics, I think the original vision, certainly among the young hippies of my era, was to increase human compassion. Those were the warriors, people who were coming home maimed, and the vision was to stop war, to reduce materialism, reduce the influence of the corporate state, if you will, to have new sets of values, to have greater altruism among each other, a type of brotherhood and sisterhood, where we all listened to each other, understood each other, welcomed each other. It was peace and love throughout the realm. That was the idea. And then psychedelics seemed to be pointing toward that was possible to achieve it. With the many visions, we saw the type of heaven that could be created if we were kinder to each other. Well, of course, one doesn't need a drug to do that. And many people have a vision without any drug. So the question is of the bioethical standards of all this. We will modify human personality by pharmacologic and genomic means, with and without psychedelics. Psychedelics have a profound, magical, theological confrontation, a type of long night of the soul searching, transformative, very widely. Can be very strenuous. You get a glimpse of the divine and a glimpse of hell, and you feel the unity of man and all living creatures. And that's a very valuable thing to have.
Yeah.
We will have drugs that will produce a kaleidoscope of perceptions and feelings. Presently I'm enjoying looking at some of the many quasi-churches that are being formed under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Here in New Mexico, we're seeing quite a number of ayahuasca churches being formed, groups that are seeking legal approval as earnest religions, circling around psilocybin use. A long-standing tradition of the Native American church involving peyote is being expanded to users of San Pedro cactus and elixirs and teas. Many are occurring, and presently it's sort of a real mix. There's no true guides other than the Supreme Court ruling and the UDV versus Uneo de Vegetal versus U.S. Customs. Was greatly successful. So I think that we're going to see a wide variety of new substances that have never been anticipated, generated by AI drug development. It's truly exciting, somewhat frightening, promising.
Yeah.
Wonderful time to be a graduate student in neuroscience. Wonderful and
Scary.
daunting. Yeah, because, as you mentioned, there's so much that we can do. We have so much capability now. So to be able to do it is it's a big task. It's a big responsibility, but I think I think one we need.
All I can recommend is keep your science strong and
Mhm.
ethical and unbiased. You know, if you come up with a result that you don't like, you keep repeating it, you still don't like it, but it's valid and can be replicated, you know, report it.
Yeah.
Just happened to me on Friday.
You know.
Literally.
You know, if it doesn't, we're going to find out what works and what doesn't. We're going to find out. There's so many people looking at this. So that will be quite a moment.
Yeah.
What works?
Right. So speaking of like graduate school, like you studied at Harvard for a graduate program, correct?
Yes, and I still am affiliated with Harvard, but I won't name that here. Okay.
Okay, that's fine. I was just curious about how you became interested in the fentanyl work that you did while you were doing your studies there.
Okay, so when I arrived at the Kennedy School of Government as a grad student after decades in the deserts and mountains doing strange things and monasteries and earlier prison tour, and suddenly I wound up at the Kennedy School, a lovely place. I strongly encourage any students listening to this for whom neurochemistry can be a little more burdensome in memorizing all those receptor subtypes, and you want something perhaps a little less stressful on the forebrain, you might consider public policy. I certainly did. Arriving at the Kennedy School under my mentor, Mark Kleiman, the late Mark Kleiman, noble, ethical, and extraordinarily brilliant man. He was also Rick Doblin's mentor at that time, a few years earlier, and was instrumental in helping structure maps to configure to FDA's approvals. Mark looked at my understanding of the underground. They were all into criminal justice and they found someone that could speak to the technology of drug advances and also public policy. So they kind of latched onto me and and made this charter. Well, now the legacy compounds, this is 96. The legacy compounds currently on the street are methamphetamine, horrible speed methamphetamine, cocaine, marijuana we won't concern ourselves about, but there were no unusual analogs. Very rarely one would see any type of variation on the legacy molecules. There were maybe 5 drugs you could find on the street. Nothing on the internet. The internet was in its fledgling state, and there weren't no drug traffic at that point. So my charter and instruction and the ultimate thesis was to determine that since we knew that drug development was moving forward quickly and we would see thousands of new compounds and some of these would be problematic, to predict what the next great malaise would be on the street. What would be the new cocaine? Mm-hmm. What would be the new heroin or methamphetamine? So I spent some time looking at synthetic approaches to all the legacy compounds, what was known about them, how to synthesize them. I had no interest in anything other than psychedelics, but looked at them all and came up with a worrisome issue in which a synthesis of a unusually potent opioid, unknown at the time, relatively unknown, small outbreaks in Moscow, a little outbreak in Boston, maybe killed 100 people, but nothing else. Just a blip in the death rate from opioids, pharmaceutical opioids. And this drug was called fentanyl. No one had heard of it. I began looking at what was a pediatric anesthetic. I began looking at it very closely. There was a small outbreak in Moscow. And so I flew to Moscow and interviewed the head of the MVD, that's the Russian equivalent of the FBI, Major General Sergeyev, oversaw 5,000 agents across 11 time zones. And he was mostly concerned about heroin coming up from Afghanistan, all the war veterans, Russian war veterans coming back, being involved in the trade. And even though there were, 50 or 60 people dying around Moscow from fentanyl, to him it was trivial and exotic. The Russian source on that was eventually located and seized, and it's kind of an interesting sideline. It turned out to be 720-ish, 20-year-old type winners of the Russian Olympiad, chemistry Olympiad, who had holed up with part of the Russian mafia, the Vor as they're called, in Kazan, Azerbaijan, and began making fentanyl and sending it up to Moscow, where it sort of got on the radar, and I found it. But once that group was serving time and the lab dismantled, there wasn't any more. A little outbreak in Boston in '93. So I'm walking around lecturing at the faculty club at the Kennedy School and School of Public Health that, look, if you're looking for the next major drug, this could be it. It's has ubiquitous precursors. I mean, you can buy a tank car of it for 50 cents a kilogram. Cheap precursors. A difficult synthesis, but that can be modified to make it simpler, which eventually took place. The question is, will the addict population use it? Only heroin addicts would even dream of injecting it. So I began to interview the heroin population in Boston. I found myself in many coffee shops sitting with heroin users, young men and women, sitting there all day tapping their feet, waiting for the candy man to appear, and we're sipping coffee. I found some survivors of the small fentanyl outbreak. Did a big survey of a few hundred of them, and asked questions such as, if fentanyl were available, this drug called fentanyl, would you prefer it to heroin? Would you use it if there were no heroin? How fast does it come on? How fast does it recede? How does it make you feel? And the results from that indicated that fentanyl was, unfortunately, substitutable for heroin among opiate users. And that was the doorway, the key to the whole thing. You can make all the exotic drugs you want, but if no one uses them, they won't enter the market. So that was the key. Ubiquity of precursors. You can buy things cheaply and make it. 2, a synthesis that could be simplified. 3, and once it's out there, people will use it. So I kind of exhausted myself going around Cambridge, pointing out that this thing's coming.
This didn't ring bells for anyone else, right? Like you mentioned, there was little outbreaks in Boston and Moscow, and people were just assuming this is some, maybe we won't see this again. It's like little things. It's not important enough. But you were.
Well, there was a researcher, Gary Henderson, at the time, who was a forensic chemist, also friends of Sasha. And we, Gary was aware that, this stuff could be a problem, but Gary thought that if the lab went away, the drug would go away, and we didn't have to worry about it proliferating. Sasha weighed in with a couple of sentences in an article called Future Drugs in '71, and we talked about it a little bit, but there was no serious look at this material becoming a major epidemic. Everyone thought, well, there'll be sporadic, tiny labs, and some people will die, but when the lab goes away, so will the phenomenon. It won't be a pharmacological wildfire that will circle the planet, right, as it has become. So we didn't think it would become the great killer. Most people thought it would not become that. At the Kennedy School, he said, "Do you want to risk your career on this this prediction?" And at the time, they were serious, of course. So speculative. It was considered science fiction. Why should this thing catch hold? But because I was familiar with underground manufacturers and their motives, I felt that all it would take is one reasonably skilled, unscrupulous underground manufacturer who didn't give a damn about human life.
Yeah. Put it on the street.
It would only take one, because there is a variation of fentanyl called carfentanil, which is 4,000 times the potency. So that a single individual in a single clandestine laboratory, for example, in Mexico or China, could make the equivalent of the world's heroin supply annually in a few weeks.
Yeah.
So my next opportunity to do anything about this, I found myself, of course, arrested in a trial for psychedelics, in which case I began talking about my work at the Kennedy School. And of course, this was, put down, of course, by the opposition as, "Judge, this trial is about LSD. It's not about fentanyl." But I went on for 2 days and presented all of the overheads and slides and work and got all the documents and testimony entered into the federal public record in perpetuity in 2003.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing I said was in 2003 at trial was, "We're going to have a big problem."
Yeah.
But of course, discredited.
Yeah.
10 years went by. Meanwhile, I'm doing life. 10 years went by. 12. And the amount of actual deaths from opioids still remained at about 3,000 emergency department admissions a year. Pretty steady from pharmaceuticals. Then I'm sitting in prison watching TV one day, and there was a large cluster of deaths, perhaps 1,000 people, from a fentanyl batch out of Toluca, Mexico. I thought, oh my, it's starting. Because once a simplified recipe gets into unscrupulous underground hands, it tends to proliferate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's enormously profitable and cheap to make. So at that point, there was no technical barrier against making this stuff. Anyone with a scrap of paper with a recipe on it could do it. Then the floodgates were opened and our problems began.
Yeah.
The Mexican cartels began to get the precursors, and the rest is, of course, history.
Yeah. It's so interesting that you were able to do the research to predict that. And before I came to VCU and started psychedelic studies here, I actually did epidemiological data analysis on fentanyl and its analogs in Detroit, in the city. So I worked with the medical examiner and compared tox reports to the deaths and doing chronic opioid like brain analysis. And it was very, very sad to see the increases in the numbers from 2014 when I, went to college to now. Even when I was working, it was about 2018, 2019. So it's really starting, all those analogs were really starting to stack up.
Yeah.
Right. The European Monitoring Center on Drugs and Drug Addiction sees hundreds of variants on these molecules, mostly coming out of China because they have the PhDs that can do these variations. But what we're seeing in America primarily at this point is of Mexican origin. I've looked at this for a long time, and I don't have a great hope that it's going to suddenly resolve or turn around. The death rate, it's several 100,000 a year or more, and it's worldwide. So this thing is entrenched with us and will be with us throughout your lifetime.
Yeah.
What will make it go away? Well, there may be, immune receptor vaccines that appear, that block the effects, like a long-term naloxone, if you will.
Mhm.
Or there may be a type of, quasi-religious awakening among users, not to try anything. We're seeing fentanyl appearing on the street, mixed, sold as fentanyl. Sorry, sold as MDMA.
Yeah,
even
that's
cocaine too. Yeah,
And
the
cocaine.
biggest things especially when talking about harm reduction with psychedelics is fentanyl is one of like the biggest concerns, right? Having to so important
having
to
testing
your
kits.
drugs. Yeah.
And the question is why, I think it's because it's so cheap and therefore it alters consciousness, and small amounts of it can be counterfeited as almost any drug.
Mhm.
Oh, this will alter your mind. Unfortunately, you risk your life therein.
So you were able to predict this, right? At the time, do you think if people took you seriously, if people were like, this is real and your research means something, do you think anything could have been done at that time to even mitigate where we're at now? Because, you're right. If one semi, competent chemist was able to understand the recipe to this or understand what this drug does and it got into those hands, then there really isn't stopping the snowball effect that comes after that. But do you think, and this is purely speculative, anything could have been done to mitigate this at that time?
Well, at the time I proposed a number of things that should be done. I said, this is going to happen, but I didn't leave it there. I suggested a number of things to block it. And among these were precursor controls of the core precursors at that time. NPP and ANPP, they were called. If you control these, put them into a precursor control schedule and made them illegal so that one couldn't easily buy them, then that would keep it out of the hands of underground manufacturers for a number of years. Of course, no one heard that. And so they were only controlled internationally, 2017 or so by the Chinese. I think DEA put them in the Federal Register about 2010 after the Toluca episode of 1,000 deaths. I suggested also that one could actually forensically, identify specific international labs from a spectroscopic analysis of sea samples, a type of signature program. There's a heroin signature program that exists. When it sees samples, one can tell if it's from Afghanistan or if it's from Colombia or its country of origin, and that can be useful for interception, if you will. But the same thing could have been done with fentanyl, but only in the last couple of years has that program been implemented. On the biological side, I suggested that fentanyl, until recently, was very difficult to see. You have a person coming and look like they're dying from a heroin overdose. It's a fentanyl overdose. Their eyes are pinned, but they have no heroin. On the tox exam in the bloodstream, the analytical instrumentation did not exist sufficient to identify fentanyl. I suggested that indeed it must. Radioimmunoassays occurred at that time. I hope we're not getting hyper technical here.
No, it's
no,
good.
great.
Yeah, it's hindsight is always 2020.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think fentanyl is like the genie that's out of the bottle, and I really don't think we're going to be able to get it back in the bottle. I think fentanyl will be superseded by other things that are even more interesting. Some may be even more lethal.
Yeah.
But the point I'm trying to make here, and I'll try to simplify it, and is that the future is dividing into several directions, several possible scenarios. We're going to have wonderful new medicines, wonderful new healing medicines, and that's where, of course, all our hearts are. But within those tens of thousands of AI developed analogs, we're going to have some little horrors, some little beasts that have never been seen that will take even more lives. So the future is both glorious and scary.
Definitely.
I think so. A big thing to come out of first of all, the psychedelic boom in the 60s and the 70s, and now with the fentanyl, one of the big things is this war on drugs, right? The government thinks that they can regulate the flow of drugs on the streets and these deaths through increasing incarceration and laws. And, oftentimes court cases that we don't fully understand in terms of, really how effective they're going to be in doing all of that. So as someone who served time due to, we would argue this war on drugs and this very, very intense stance the US government takes on drugs and classifying them all as being a certain way.
Even those like non-harmful or non-violent, right?
Yeah, all would be considered under the same umbrella. Do you think that this is an effective way, first of all, to approach any issues having to do with drugs, right? And nonviolent crimes involving drugs? And a little bit about your experience, I think, with all of this and what you take away from it. Yeah.
Well, even though it's a miracle that we are speaking, that I'm not dying in prison, and even though the suffering was unspeakable, I still remain somewhat conservative with regard to complete legalization. I'll probably catch a great deal of flack about this from this presentation. I'm very much in favor of harm reduction and decriminalization of natural plant substances. I'm behind the decrim movement. I think penalties should be considerably lowered for most drugs, but I think that things like fentanyl need to be very strongly enforced. I'm not terribly in favor of making cocaine or methamphetamine completely legal. That would introduce a whole new populations that heretofore had not tried it due to its illegality or inaccessibility or moral stigma, if you will. I don't think, mom and pop would do well on $10 a gram cocaine. I think we would have, I think it would produce a certain devastation in society. So I do feel that, the classical narcotics should remain controlled, but far less penalized.
Do you think that there could be a separation between those, with the fentanyl, for example, those who, get caught with something that was adulterated with fentanyl that, like, perhaps they didn't know it was fentanyl and how they could still go to prison for having it versus like those who are purposely obtaining it or purposely manufacturing it? Do you think there should be a separation?
Well, I think if a person is ignorant that their sample contained this drug that's more heavily penalized, that should be a consideration by the court, of course.
Yeah, just curious.
But we're moving into realms of law and drug policy. I think most of your listeners might enjoy other tales.
Fine. Yeah, sorry. Just that was a quick question I had.
Good. Okay, good. Yeah.
So why don't we talk a little bit about your book, The Rose of Paracelsus. So what was your inspiration for writing The Rose? And also, why the name? It's a very interesting, very unique name. And it was, I think, great to sort of come across. But tell us a little bit about the inspiration and why the motivation behind it.
Goodness. Well,
you got the hard questions.
15 years.
I'm a hard hitter 15, here.
15 years into 2 life sentences, things look rather bleak.
I cannot imagine.
Yeah.
It's a very empty cell. There's no children, no loved ones. Everything is gone. There's no money, no job, no respect. Most friends have gone, but some stay, and a few new ones are made. But it's all very remote. One is completely disempowered. One has no hands, no voice. No one will listen to you in prison. The guards don't want to hear anything you say. What to do? I thought I would tell a story and somehow get it out there in the real world somehow, and try to remember not only what the world looked like, having not seen trees or flowers for a decade, and to try to remember some of the beauty and some of the heart and the feeling of why people did what they did that allegedly were at the higher levels of psychedelic distribution, the underground chemist of yore.
Mm-hmm.
What was their motivation? What were their lifestyles like? What did they think? How did they behave? Who did they love? Who loved them? I thought that might be of interest to some of the young people.
Yeah.
And so within that framework, I began to write in pencil, and a little each day, and it became quite a habit, and then would overtake days and weeks. And after the first year, I looked at this great manuscript of handwritten material, and by that time I'd learned enough about writing that I realized I should throw it into the trash pits. So I did, and began again, a little even more seriously, using everything I'd learned and felt, and tried to write lines that were like a kind of long poem, kind of song, lines that one say were singing to one's grandchildren, or singing to a distant lover,
Mm-hmm.
or singing to one who had the ears to hear it. And I thought, well, there might be a handful of people that, one day would find this particularly of interest.
Absolutely.
So I wrote it with that spirit in mind. I wanted to talk about the beauty and the passion and the pathos of living underground with a great vision that was oppressed, and one had to fear of guns and being captured, and living like that every second of every day for one's entire life, all because of a particular vision in one's youth that said that these things may be wonderful for the human spirit and heart.
How were you able to connect with all of that? So you have some beautiful themes in the book, right? You talk about heaven and hell, darkness and light, white flowers, and a lot of spirituality. So in a place, mentally, physically, in a dark and a desolate place in your life and in your head, how are you able to connect with all of that? Because I can't even connect with the good in the world sometimes in my very normal, very regular life. How are you able to do that?
Well, I mean, you're very blessed, as you, Alaina. And it's important that we all remember that in whatever is going on in our lives, even in the greatest imaginable darkness, there is still a light. And we too are blessed. So I try to hold on to that.
Yeah.
The words became more comfortable, and I began to have a sense of freedom about saying things. So I began to get, wilder and wilder, and reaching out. It was kind of a death song, if you will. In the writing of The Rose, I had no idea I would ever be free.
Right.
The future was, falling over in some bleak cell with nobody cared at all. Ultimately, it would be that, to become weaker and weaker and more detached, and finally fall down. So that was the future. But there was this lovely little thing called a pen in my hand. And even though no one in the prison would listen, I could speak to the mythical friend, the mythical loved one, my own children, that had very little contact with their father for their entire lives, that I might never see. I might never hold or talk to them or explain to them. I'm out of contact for decades. So I wrote it for loved ones and friends and children, that one day they could hear their father's voice and maybe understand a little of why we did what we did and why we risked our lives to do it.
Yeah, I really appreciated the way that it was written. It was very poetic. It was the beauty that you were going for, like, very much came across. Like, there were moments where I was like very touched by the care that went into the words. And I did really like the, that play on heaven and hell and darkness and light throughout the book, and how you spoke about specifically the moments with the children, and how the children were always cared for by the six in the book. Like, it was something that I thought was very well done.
I hadn't seen children in so many years and hadn't seen my own.
Yeah.
That, and this happens to a lot of men, that when a little girl comes on TV or something, it's like, it's a type of heartache just to see them. Even though I'm free now and my children are all grown up and, we're friends. When I see, 4 or 5-year-olds, kind of like they were when I left, it's the most beautiful thing in the world.
Yeah.
So in the book, we do talk about children and in a loving way. And the six, of course, always strongly cared. There were a number of stories about children that had some difficult moments due to disability or abuse, and how they were rescued or cherished, or put on the right path by the six. And perhaps that was, my way of trying to express those feelings in words when I could not do it physically or verbally. Create the mythos. Men in long periods of captivity, don't entirely lose their humanity. I often lecture sometimes at universities, and I always put up a slide of these ants. What are these ants doing up here? And I tell the story of the ants, which is the prison yard was simply dirt and gray 30-foot walls. And there were no pets, there were no dogs, no cats, no kids, nothing living. And so men would do strange things like capture tarantulas, for example, in the Arizona desert. And tarantulas don't bite, really. They walk very delicately, like little old ladies, very soft and furry legs. Men would capture these things and keep them as pets. And they would find a pigeon who perhaps had their one leg cut off and trying to fly through razor wire, and feed it bits of bread and raise it. And other men would make little cardboard running wheels, because you couldn't build anything or construct anything, but you could slice a bit of cardboard stolen from the kitchen and sort of glue that together somehow or not, and make a little running wheel. And then they would capture a mouse and cherish the mouse and feed it and put it on the running wheel. And the mice really love this. And so guys that had mice on running wheels would attract little crowds at night for men to come in just to see something living, running freely and being cared for. And it got so extreme, of course, that you would see around a small ant hole in the yard, groups of, guys in their 60s and 70s, great, big, strong, tatted up, individuals who had seen the horror of life. They're all standing around just standing there looking at the hole in the ground and maybe putting out little bits of apple or cracker or something they'd stolen and got out of the chow hall and got the dining area and gotten through multiple metal detectors and phalanxes of guards searching their pockets, and they got it out on the yard, and they would go to the ant hole and feed the ants and remark about their strength in holding up a bit of cracker or something of that nature. And men became very fond of the ants after dinner and would, feel low when they went away in the winter and eagerly anticipate their arrival in the spring, the cycle of winter and spring forever.
Mm-hmm. At any point, did you think about, the road that you had been on, and now you're away from your children, and in your head at that time that was the rest of your life? Did you ever think about the past and maybe wish that you had done differently?
Well, at 16, 16, 17, 18, I was raised in an academic family, and my intention was to go into neuroscience, get my doctorate in neuro, and teach and do research. That was the path. The only thing I ever considered. And of course, when this exotic neurochemical began changing an entire generation of my peers, and people began to talk about their realization of the beauty of the forest and the oceans and the unity of our hearts and universal consciousness, and realizing that they actually had minds. Saw all this happening and thought, well, this is quite different, and it seemed to be extraordinarily important. And so we thought that we were, heirs to something of great value to our species. Mm-hmm. And that our species needed to go in different directions and not destroy this earth. We needed to love the plants and animals and each other, and not create great killing machines. We saw that as a fundamental flaw, that the human heart had made a great error. And so a number of us went that way. Now, the barrier to entry in the psychedelic community is open, and we're seeing thousands of new people coming and having their experiences in the classical manner. It's a joyous time to observe this. I have considerable hope for the future.
And how does it feel to know that you ushered in this era, right? Like you were part of us opening up our minds to, understanding these substances and the neuroscience. You mentioned that neuroscience was your big love and your big dream when you were younger. And now we are both PhDs studying neuroscience and psychedelics. Like, how does that feel for you, that you have not only inspired so much change socially, but also academically? Exactly.
Well, I would contest that. First of all, you both are highly trained, enormously promising, very young, and you are responsible for a huge amount of the future. You can't see it now, but your work will unfold before you and open vast vistas for tens of thousands of people. Your research and your directions will influence a very large segment of the future. So you can't put it all on one person. you trust in yourself, have faith that your own activities will be of enormous benefit. I know they will. And in terms of the past and the early stages of this phenomenon, there were, if you're speaking of underground chemistry, there were identifiable quite a number of people. Owsley, Augustus Stanley Owsley. I just had lunch with his wife here recently, Roni. Owsley put out the very first large-scale batches, 65, 66. Over his lifetime, he made about 500 grams. That's 1 million doses. Nikki Sand, and a dear friend, and Tim Scully, same, were the central figures in a group called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. In the early 70s, put out, or throughout Nikki's life, rather, put out Nikki 13 kilograms. That's 250 million doses by DEA standard. The Kansas lab, presumably in which I was presumably involved, according to the primary government witness, put out that same equivalent every year for 20 years. Of course, from my view, that's far-fetched, but no one can really speak to the truth of matters, or no one will.
Right.
So it's the government tends to inflate figures. But before the 60s and the underground chemist, just going back through the early area, the indigenous peoples, of course, for thousands of years. The beloved Maria Sabina, the first curandera, who was being disinterred socially, sing such beautiful songs. There's collections of Maria's songs, and one of which he's singing, trying to heal one of the villagers in Huatla de Jimenez in Oaxaca with her mushroom ceremony, a mushroom velada, and she's calling upon the spirits, and she's intoxicated, of course, with cubensis, and she's going, describing herself, hummingbird woman am I, eagle woman am I, woman of the whirling whirlwind am I, woman of the shooting stars am I.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
beautiful.
Yeah.
It's like kind of leaves you a little breathless, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I'm glad Maria is being looked upon so favorably these years. The villagers were very upset with her. In the mid-50s, she encountered the banker Gordon Wasson from New York, had an interest in psychedelics, and exposed him to it. And this all appeared in the primary magazine at the time. I just saw an original issue, perhaps 57, and there's Maria around the campfires. And I recall seeing that article at 12, but I had no idea of the life before me afterwards. There's a lovely history to all this. Fragments of it have been told in various ways, but I have yet to see a truly respectful, comprehensive history of the whole thing.
yeah, I mean, it's difficult to encapsulate all of it, right? And especially because everyone tells a different story, so it's hard to get at the heart of it.
Well,
Everyone tells a different story, and this is also important to people in a lot of different ways, right? Like the religious aspect to it, the cultural, the spirituality aspect of it. We talk about, you just mentioned one of your big visions with all your colleagues and your peers at the time was to help humanity see its own humanity, right? Love and peace and all of that. And that's a very spiritual, and that harkens back to, a lot of the cultural uses. It's used in a lot of practices, but these substances can do this for us, but the power dynamics that we exist in, right? Like the way that our cultures, and I'm specifically now talking about Western American culture, right? The dynamics that we exist in. We're gonna talk about psychedelics and capitalism in a couple of episodes. I think that these substances go a long way in helping people understand spirituality. But can we really understand it while existing in this structure that, can promote greed and power imbalance or power one way or the other? I think is so difficult. And that's partly what makes the history so difficult, because we don't have we can't contextualize it in the same exact way.
That's really an important observation, Zarmeen. It's right. I'm presently in venture space. Every week I look at. I work for JLS Fund in New York, and we every week we interview any number of young founders, chemists, physicians, neuropharmacologists that have their pitch decks, and they're looking for investment to start up a fund. So pitch after pitch, and occasional one will be funded. Many seem very promising, and some seem opportunistic. Some are without strong scientific support and seem hastily done. Mm-hmm. Others have very distinguished boards and may well survive. But this is all a very corporate world.
Yeah.
Corporate. I mean, it's SEC, FDA approved, SEC controlled. Boards of advisors, term sheets, convertible notes. You've got chief financial officers and chief scientific officers. And this is a whole new way of looking at what only a few years ago was entirely in the hands of the underground, where it has been forever.
Yeah.
Even now, the underground, if you will, that would be normal humans that are just curious about use. It's no one going, gee, I'm depressed over my loss of my husband and I need going to take this drug to heal. It's just people in the forest walking hand in hand, nibbling on a bit of mushroom in the moonlight, around the oceans, around the campfires, and that's how it's been for a very, very long time. And that has gone on successfully and changed lots of lives, enhanced aesthetics and appreciation of art and music and each other. Mm-hmm. Now, it's heavily corporatized, heavily politicized, heavily medicalized, and sometimes I think of the young people that sometimes come to me and whisper, "What about the sacred?" Mm-hmm. And I understand what they're saying. It's a question of, I don't think that that essential heart will be extinguished by the current trappings of corporatization. It all comes down to the individual looking inward with the assistance of these sacraments, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, that unspeakable connection with the divine, that change, that opening of the human heart and mind, that's extremely precious, and there's no value that can be put upon it monetarily. Yeah. And it cannot be regulated. It can't be controlled. Hopefully it's reproducible. But there it is. So this kind of special, elusive, magical, eternal, most precious moment is being bounced around in accounting realms. And
yeah, it's like the social ritual and like the spiritual ritual that psychedelics have been known to be taken, in the context. In the context that you're taking these, has been kind of washed away and medicalized. It's like it's within this wall now in this box, and I think that's something that definitely I hope the field addresses moving forward, is that we can't just put these things in this box of a treatment. It's still going to be a spiritual use. It's still going to be this profound, powerful experience for people that, can be, used to treat people like we've mentioned before. But I think only recognizing it that way, which is kind of what's going on right now, is a loss for the community.
And you know what? It's a big part of it, I think, is in efforts to control, right? Like to control the way that these drugs are used. If you're able to say, hey, this is the way that we're going to present these drugs to you, and you don't know enough to use these on your own and get those benefits out of them without us or without our trained therapists or without the way that we're using them, I think it's easy to monetize something like that, because now you're monetizing an experience that you're selling to people, that you're telling people you can't get this on your own, right? You can't get this anywhere else. And I think it's easy to do because of the misinformation.
Yeah.
And this is probably something that was very different from your day, but now we have articles and headlines where people are like, psychedelics and psychedelic medicine is the next big thing, and it's the answer to all of our problems. Well, the truth is, it's probably the answer for a lot of people's problems, but there's a lot of other uses to these drugs, and we are selling them in one way, and it's to sell them. I think it comes back to like monetizing all of these drugs. So this whole legalization and this medicalization, do you think that it can exist alongside the spirituality that these drugs are supposed to, in a lot of cultures and a lot of religions, stand for, right? So I guess this is kind of going back to what we talked about before, but yeah, the whole legalization and medicalization aspect of it.
Well, it can exist in parallel and does exist in parallel. I mean, both paths are happening.
Mm-hmm.
The above ground, if you will, discourse, of course, is on the billions that are flowing into the space and the mainstreaming of it. In the 60s, we dressed and had long hair and wore unusual clothes, and among them were bell bottoms. So I knew the party was over when I saw bell bottoms in Macy's.
Yeah, they're coming back.
Point. Yeah.
Yeah, there are two paths. One is, of course, people who have serious medical problems,
mm-hmm.
and we hope that this class of compounds can be helpful for them.
Mm-hmm.
But the much larger part of the iceberg, which generally is unspoken about, is the continuing illegal use. It may be of great value, but still is prohibited in society. And that's a much larger group of people, but we don't hear much about it because the corporations can't make anything from it. It's all still underground, still between friends, still very hush-hush, and that's all going on. Nora Volkow, the great Nora Volkow, MD, who directs NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, is a friendly, and she thinks that the continuing medicalization will increase underground use. And the question is that a negative?
Right. The argument right now.
I make this statement rather often, but it may be of value to do so here. Right now, the emphasis is on treating people with identifiable psychiatric issues. But that's only recently. That's only since Roland did his great work in 2015, and to some extent, Rick recognizing its value of MDMA and PTSD in the 90s. And goodness, before all that, though, the underground generally felt it was not wise to give these materials to anybody with obvious problems.
Mm-hmm.
The person's having difficulties in their relationship, or is skitsy or uncertain, or seemingly unbalanced in any way, which considered sinful to expose them these materials. You didn't want to sit up all night holding hands. You didn't want them to be in any type of psychic pain or people around them. It could be a very difficult, long period. And that worked well with very little public problems from these materials. Now, in order to get them, you have to go, one is sick, one is a definable neurosis, if you will.
Mhm.
Of course, all ranges are being treated. I mean, the Oregon model allows individuals to come in without pronouncing any type of clinical presentation. So multiple experiments being done through multiple states, completely different structures. And this is all good. This is all good because so many experiments are going on involving these. The social experiments, the treatment providers, the state regulations, the drug designers. There's 1,000 emerging points of light. So we shall see how it all evolves. Trying to predict the outcome in the next 4 to 5 years is truly challenging.
Yeah.
I think Rick's in a very good position with MAPS to have an FDA approval.
Mhm.
So that will be the bellwether moment for the entire industry. But FDA is a funny beast, they can, most things even don't make it to phase 3.
Right.
30% make it to phase 3. And even after that, FDA behind closed doors and some Mattel and Bethesda makes some sort of decision based on goodness knows what.
Yeah.
Those aren't public minutes, and there may be a political influence on it. But it looks as though the Biden administration is acting favorably, and you've got Cory Booker and Rand Paul's new Breakthrough Therapies Act, and that's extremely promising litigation. And you've got our veterans working hard in DC. Jesse Gould at Heroic Hearts. The legislators on the Hill listen to the warfighters. They listen to their uniformed military. And the uniformed military is saying they were in great pain. In some instances, ayahuasca or this other material helped them enormously. And coming from those men and women, people on the Hill are starting to hear.
There was just a bill in Virginia there's a Senate bill and a House bill, and neither of them passed, unfortunately. They got tabled, but it was really cool. I spoke in favor in front of the Congress people for one of them, and I got to hear out the testimony from a lot of the veterans as well, like within this session, and it was really moving. And I was moved to like tears. And then I was like, how did you table that? Like, I was so moved, and none of these people were listening. Like, it made me mad. But that's in Virginia, where
very, very moving, very moving. Yeah. The recitation of trauma among soldiers, the changes they went through, and the particular horrors of the war to them. I mean, if these materials can be helpful, so be it. I think the Virginia just it was a knee-jerk reaction. It's early. It's a few years ago. It was unheard of.
Right.
It's just it's wild how responsive legislators are becoming. States, it's a domino effect we're seeing. We'd better be right.
We'll see.
Right.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about the past, and now in the present, in the current, there's a lot of big organizations that are helping move this forward, right? In both in sort of medicalization and legalization and decriminalization, but it's, a lot in the science as well, and exploring the capacity of these drugs and actually understanding these drugs. And I think one of the biggest, we can't talk about psychedelics without talking about MAPS and Rick Doblin. And
like you've mentioned.
Yeah, and you've mentioned him a few times. So how does your relationship with Rick Doblin, does that sort of inform the way that you are, approaching these drugs now? Yeah, and all of the research and all of the studies that are happening with MDMA and PTSD and just like this big boom of research that MAPS has really helped supporting.
And I have a question about what you mentioned, that Rick Doblin also went to the Kennedy School. Did you know him when you were also there? And was he the same as he is now?
We did. We did. We knew Rick was there a few years before me, but we had the same mentor.
I didn't know that.
He mentioned that.
Same mentor, and socialize a bit. I have always been greatly in favor of Rick's vision. In the very early years, I recall sitting in prison when I first saw the first issue of Maps, in which Rick had drawn a little eagle kind of coming out of an egg and fledgling, being born. It's kind of a little rough thing. And I'm sitting, this is perhaps 88. I'm sitting there in prison looking at this thing and going, this fellow has major courage, coming out and speaking publicly and promoting this idea of, let's openly use this material for treatment or what have you. I thought it was an immensely brave act. My life had been spent indoors, away from everyone, never breathing a word, having entirely different personas, all extremely clandestine and secret. And so here's this marvelously visionary and brave individual speaking openly about it. And I very much admire that. When I would bounce into Rick on the street around Cambridge, I always said how much I honored his path, and he's done very well. I was at Rick's his PhD defense in 96 at a Kennedy School in a little forum with his mentor and various researchers, and yours truly, and the special agent in charge of the DEA Boston office attended as well, Paul Brown. So this is in the height of the Kennedy School, guards at the front door and what have you. And Rick got his PhD then, and
incredible.
Yeah. Rick has he hasn't changed. He's still smiles a lot, and very easy to relate to. He carries the vision in the heart, and I think he's the perfect representative for this revolution, and is being widely honored, and I honor him as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I think we're gonna end, if that's fine with you. I had one quick, just from the book, quote that I wanted to ask you about, because I really liked it. And so this quote, it relates to that concept of the darkness, light, heaven, and hell. And it starts off and then goes into saying, Paraidse or Inferno for those who dared assume the difference. And
Gorgeous.
I really think a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of talking about that balance, right, between the bad that could happen, the good that's happening. And so I just wanted to, one, let you know that I really like that quote, and two, just maybe can we end kind of talking about that concept and what it meant in terms of your writing, and then just moving forward.
Well, that Paraidse Inferno quote, I think, was in the latter part of the book. So congratulations on getting through about 600 pages of very difficult English.
I love that kind of writing.
Yeah.
It was as soon as I started it, I was like, oh my gosh, yes.
We were texting each other back and forth about it. Yeah.
Well, that's quite wonderful. Next month, the book is premiering at the Turin Book Festival. It's been translated into Italian.
Wow.
And great theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli wrote the preface, one of the founders of quantum gravity theory.
Wow.
Yeah. Interesting legs. The heaven and hell thing, I think we were talking about some of the classical changes that are observed in psychedelic experiences, some of the phenomena, particularly with acid, if you will. Of course, the book is about big acid, global acid. Okay. Some of the classical changes that are rather commonly seen among people newly entering the realm, and among those would be like a birth experience, a sense of being born. You may require 800 micrograms or more to go through. Death experience, if you think you're dying, and how can your heart even beat with these incredible changes that are going on? Senses of the unity, of course, as we mentioned before, of living things. And one of the characteristic things is a heaven and hell experience. And I hearken back to a scene at Berkeley where an individual, I can't say who, was experimenting one night with Carrie Mullis's first gram. The inventor of the polymerase chain reaction, the 1996 Nobel laureate, who had the insight into the polymerase chain reaction while on his motorcycle, taking a good part, the same part of the same gram, and it kind of came on up around Boonville, just below Mendocino, as he's roaring up from Berkeley, and there it is, and he sees the DNA molecules twisting and combining, and he had the insight into PCR on acid and got the Nobel Prize for it, which he admits in his book Dancing in the Minefield. But that night, said individual was on Carrie's acid, sitting by the biochemistry building rather late, going through rather serious changes. And there was a little dog sitting, the individual was sitting on a bench, this little dog poking around. And the dog sometimes looked very ill and unhappy and diseased and, twisted, and the plants around looked kind of malevolent, and the people were strange. I was feeling great discomfort and universal malaise, and that was kind of hell.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the next moment, the dog was happy and warm and soft and fluffy, the great big eyes, and the trees were just lush and beautiful, and the lovely gases that we breathe, and everyone is walking around this states of health and open hearts and smiling eyes, and that was heaven. And this image went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and the question for the individual was, what was the difference between the two?
Mm-hmm.
And the difference between the two was when in the midst of hell, the individual thought of love.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And important.
And that's just one small story, and millions of personal anecdotes of these phenomena can't truly be characterized. There may be some overarching characterizations, the phenomena we just discussed, but everything seems very personal.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a question of, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. I think this is a very personal topic for everyone, right? Like, you have to come to your own conclusions about
your own experiences.
Yeah. Right. Just I suppose I end our conversation today, although we could talk for days.
Yeah, we really could.
Perhaps we can talk again.
Follow up sometime.
I just would suggest in your own careers, clearly you have the vision and the talent. So it's very important that you go forward with that. Don't be afraid to talk to anyone. Don't be afraid to share wildly speculative ideas.
Yeah.
Always speak up, always reach out, always dream. Yeah. Read. Talk to everyone. Indulge the joy of the density of information in this evolutionary moment. Mm-hmm. For ourselves and our species. And you shine your light, shine your love.
Gorgeous.
Yes.
And with that,
wonderful words to live by.
Yeah. And I think that's the perfect way to sort of end this. So thank you so much for speaking with us and to our listeners, and sharing your experiences and your sort of, I think, profound thoughts. Mm-hmm. And I hope that everyone that has stuck around has questions or any ideas. Please reach out to us and engage. But thank you, everyone, for listening. And thank you so much for sharing everything with us today.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely.
Thank you.